Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter in 1787 to James Madison. And the title of that letter, basically, or his quote, was a little rebellion now and then is a good thing.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Beneath the Law. My name is Gavin Ty. I'm here with my good friend and overmodulated partner, Stephen Teal.
I'm going to be jumping through the roof here and give our producer a heart attack.
Yeah, listen, you're as hot as a tamale, my friend. So it's a remarkable day for poor Stephen. He on his way we're actually in downtown Toronto. As we speak.
Yeah, almost killed a pedestrian without even getting close to her with my car.
Yeah, you have that effect.
She's giving me
people.
bad vibes.
It's just your presence, my friend. It just intimidates and strikes fear to the very core of their being, and especially when you're behind the wheel of an automobile. So you had a road rage experience. Actually, it was a pedestrian rage experience.
Yeah, I wasn't enraged. She was enraged, but it's like, leave me alone. I'm sorry. just trying to get to work.
Has anybody in the history of calming people down ever been calmed down by the words calm down or the mad gesticulations of the person seeking the calmness of the other? Serenity, it is not imposing upon oneself. It is not a Zen thing to do. So not a Zen day for you on the traffic front. Is that fair to say?
Well, you know what? I'm fine now. Now let's get into the outrageous podcast that we have to discuss.
You had a pedestrian insurrection on your hands this morning. The pedestrians were taking over the roadways, the highways, and the byways of the greater Toronto area.
It was a pedestrian rebellion.
Okay, well, thou shalt not add aid or comfort to members of the rebellion or insurrection. So saith the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And interestingly enough, we've all been hearing a lot about the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, of course, with the January 6th riots, and depending on how your nomenclature that you choose to describe that event, you'll note that a great many of them repeatedly use the word insurrection, and that's not, I think, a coincidence. What do you think? What do you think about that, Stephen?
I just think, Gavin, it's gone on far too long. My observation in terms of United States politics right now is the more that they keep bringing up that Donald Trump was engaged in an insurrection against his own country, speaking from the podium because he said some words, is going to make him the next president of the United States. They're just feeding his popularity, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard another way a description of this has been lawfare. And lawfare has been waged, certainly. Mr. Trump would be a dream client from a lot of lawyers' perspective and has undoubtedly been a great supporter of the legal profession in the last 12 months. But the lawfare that we're going to talk about specifically today was the decision coming out of Colorado that took Mr. Trump's name, or purported to propose to take Mr. Trump's name off any ballot for the presidential election scheduled to occur in November. And picking up on your point, I mean, I think that it's pretty important as Canadians that we sit back and lots of Canadians look at the U.S. situation and roll their eyes or, oh, what's going on down there in the U.S. I think that the ethos of the United States, of course, is very different than the founding principles of Canada. Canada was, of course, born of discussion and genteel, please, Your Majesty, can we be self-governing at this stage? Would it be okay? And in our profoundly Canadian apologetic way, we were born of a country as a dominion of the sovereign, and still have to this day the sovereign as the head of our state. In fact, Canada was, of course, refuge to a great many Americans who fled the U.S. in the American Revolution, becoming the United Empire Loyalists, which, if anyone from Eastern Ontario knows, of course, the Loyalist Parkway, where many settled along the banks of the St. Lawrence River. So Canada was very much born of the realm, if you will, of discussion, of knowing one's place. America was born of fire. America was born of revolution. It was born of insurrection. Basically, if one were to speak to, I think, King George at the time, he would have most certainly called George Washington an insurrectionist. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, he would have called him a rebel. And look, I think that's a quite accurate comparison here, Gavin, because my understanding of history, just in a very simple back of the envelope, is Canada expanded westward by sending in the RCMP and the banks, and basically, that's how we expanded. Whereas, when you look at the United States, it's all about the whole frontiermanship, I guess, for lack of a better term, frontier spirit. And that's how the United States was created, in terms of their spirit. And, I may have wanted to mention this a little bit later in the podcast, but when you talk about the spirit of the United States and how it was formed, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter in 1787 to James Madison. And the title of that letter, basically, or his quote, was a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. And right, and so when you compare in terms of what has happened with former President Trump, who, in my view, according to polls in the United States, is going to have a landslide victory at this stage of the election process. What he did, or what he said, if you want to call it rebellion, was he wasn't inciting, in my view, an insurrection. But let's get to the Colorado court.
Well, yeah, I think that's really where I want to. I mean, the repeated description of the January 6th events, and look, what happened happened. I certainly don't condone the lawlessness that occurred on January 6th. I don't condone the storming of the Bastille mentality that seemed to take place that day. But I mean, the use of the word insurrection, in my respectful view, has been a little disingenuous and designed to feed a narrative that led to the decision in the Colorado state court, Colorado, I think it was a state court, Colorado Supreme Court of the state of Colorado, which is important because the words insurrection, of course, come directly, and it's not a word that's not a word, quite frankly, that I would expect many of us would have used prior to January 6th, or even most of us who were other than scholars of the United States Constitution would probably not have used the word insurrection to describe the January 6th events, but they've certainly been used since that time. So insurrection arises because it is specifically referred to in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And the Section 3 of that amendment, which I think the history of that amendment is pretty important to understanding what this is all about. So the 14th Amendment came about after the American Civil War. And of course, the American Civil War was probably one of the most defining moments in the history of the United States. It led to a complete, I think, overview of what the United States was. It was a battle on many fronts, primarily about the horrific evils of slavery, but on another level, probably a more antiseptic one of states' rights versus federal rights. And remember that the United States, again, was born of this notion that states were sovereign, states were not going to be dictated to by some king across the pond, that they ran their own show. And in the very name of the country, the United States, I mean, the states unified, but the states had their own power. So the question, I guess, in the Civil War was, did that power extend so far as to allow certain states to have a system which was inherently evil and abhorrent of slavery, but they had the right to do it, and you don't have the right to say they couldn't do it. And so ultimately, that tension between states' rights and federal power led to the Civil War. And following that, of course, we had the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which, if one thinks about it, of course, you had a great many politicians, ex-soldiers in the Confederacy, in the South, and the reborn federal United States, the now unified states, did not want those people involved in government. In fact, the fourth section, I thought this was a pretty interesting section. The fourth section of the 14th Amendment talks about Section 3, that I'm mistaken. The second section talks about the power of a state to vote in what is the electoral college. The weighting of a state's vote had to take out, and it's a very pre-emancipation type section, but talks about take out the vote of the percentage of male voters over 21 who had participated in the Civil War. So they took away from the South and the veterans of the South and the politicians of the South the ability theoretically to participate fully in the reborn federal democracy, including Section 3, which says no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president. I think that those words are important. Elector of vice president brings the electoral college element into this, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, et cetera, who having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress, who shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same. In other words, the whole point of the 14th Amendment, in my view, was to make sure that the people behind the establishment of the Confederacy and the ensuing war, which would certainly be considered an insurrection or rebellion, could not come in through the back door and take high office in the reborn and newly formed union.
Well, and I think, Gavin, just from a legal perspective, the context of the use of those words and what they mean, I think is important, because certainly in that light, one could not say that President Trump was involved in an insurrection.
Well, I mean, in the context of in the context, Trump's a pretty old guy, but he wasn't fighting in the war in the 1850s. So, if the section is read narrowly in its contextually, the answer is it applied to individuals who were involved in the Confederacy
in a very serious act, which was a war.
Well, which led to a war, led to the partition and cessation of the original Union. So, and then a war subsequently with respect to that. But I mean, certainly to my mind, that's a narrow reading of it. Now, that has been given a rather expansive reading post January 6th by many people who are not do not like Mr. Trump and do not want him to be president, and would like very much for the January 6th events to be categorized as a, quote, insurrection, because it would then theoretically, arguably fit under Section 3 and bar, by that thinking, Trump from being the president.
Well, and I think, Gavin, I think what's important there is when we talk about this U.S. Supreme Court decision, they don't even touch that issue. They don't touch the issue of whether former President Trump was involved in an insurrection or rebellion, because the case doesn't actually even turn on that. And for the Colorado courts to make a finding that Donald Trump was involved in an insurrection is very curious, because as far as I remember and recall, I don't think Trump gave any evidence in the underlying proceeding that led to the Colorado Supreme Court saying that it was okay to remove former President Trump from ballots in the state.
Yeah, so just to give the judicial history of this proceeding that ended up in front of the Supreme Court relatively recently. So the court of first instance found that Trump had in fact committed acts of insurrection, but the petition was denied on the grounds that the presidency was not an office under the United States under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So in other words, to go back to that, an elector of the president, not the president. I mean, it's a very curiously worded section, because we in the United States, of course, we have electors who are appointed under the electoral college system, and they are the ones. That was what January 6th was about. Go hang Mike Pence, because he's the electors are delivering their ballots, which they're compelled to do. I mean, if anything, the thinking behind the January 6th riot was pretty ill-conceived from a legal perspective. But regardless of that, so the court of first instance says, yep, we find as a fact that he did participate in an insurrection, but the amendment doesn't apply to him. The Colorado Supreme Court reversed that decision, upholding the finding that the president had in fact engaged in insurrection, and finding that no, the wording of section of the 14th Amendment did apply to the office of president, such that the state had the authority to remove the former president from the ballot. And that's the issue that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's really going back to your comment, isn't that really what this is all about? Did a state have the power to remove a candidate for president, a federal office, from the ballot in that state, in the context of the electoral college system in the United States, where states have a certain number of electoral college ballots? If you win the state, you get the ballots for the state, and those are then elected or voted by the electors of the president and the vice president. So I mean, it was really a division of powers case, in my view, as much as it was certainly not, as you pointed out, there was no need to find that he engaged in insurrection or didn't engage in insurrection. I mean, the court, as you said, didn't touch that finding of fact when we're there. They just said it's irrelevant because the state doesn't have the power to do what it did.
Right. Well, look, I in some respects, although they don't directly deal with that issue, the majority opinion. Now, all 9 judges came down the same way. They said that a state in the United States does not have the power to remove a presidential candidate from a ballot. So they were all in agreement with that. But if you look at the majority judgment a little bit more closely, they use as one of the justifications for that each state basically has different processes and procedures, including evidentiary rules, in terms of when someone can be removed from a ballot, I guess, as I understand it, and that they speak to a patchwork that one state might find that a presidential candidate has breached Section 3, whereas another state would not find that a former president has breached Section 3, and so then you have a patchwork of an election system where in some states somebody's on the ballot, but in other states they've ruled that person can't be on the ballot, and that is a preposterous and chaotic. Even the minority judgment called it a chaotic kind of system. So that absolutely makes no sense.
Well, I think it brings it back, one of the themes that we were talking about, and the same is true certainly for Canadian federalism and one of the issues in division of powers here in Canada. But, even the name, the United States, when you really think about it, step back, it's almost an oxymoron. in the sense that it's the states are interested in individual states' right. You talked about this patchwork quilt. They're sovereign. They control their own processes, etc. But what the United States was all about, I assume, was the uniting of all of those individual interests into a common uh, into a common endeavor, the federal national interest, which in certain instances overrode the individual states' rights. So it's this tension always in the U.S. and in Canada between provincial rights and federal rights, and certainly in the United States between states' rights and federal rights, and where one goes and when the other. And really, if you're right in the sense that if you had a patchwork quilt, if you will, of uh, numerous tests and whatnot, you could theoretically have situations where an individual could be on the ballot for president in one state and on another, and then those states wouldn't be very united, would they, if they had different candidates for president in each different state?
Well,
It'd be kind of
and
crazy.
if I understand this correctly, the state of Maine, which was one of the states that removed or said that Donald Trump could not be on, I guess they were the primary election ballots, so basically that would flow into the election ballot. That it's basically the Secretary of the State that made the decision, and that there was no procedure whatsoever with respect to the removal of the name. So it's just would be, like I said, it would be complete chaos, nonsense in my view, to not have the decision that the Supreme Court of the United States, all 9 judges, agreed to, that the states do not have the right, without any kind of certainly criminal finding against former President Trump, that he committed an act of insurrection in violation of Section 3. And I think this is very important as well, that it's actually a provision under the United States Code, going way, way back, being first enacted, I think, in 1862 or 1870, under legislation, the Confiscation Act of 1862, the Enforcement Act of 1870, that really gave the authority to the federal government, creating a crime if you engaged in an insurrection. So that's where the authority lies. The authority lies at the federal level. It doesn't lie at the state level.
Right. So ultimately, the decision out of the Supreme Court, whatever you might think of Donald Trump, and whatever you might think or describe the events of January 6th, insurrection, rebellion, party, some might call it, or a really fun time, other really crazy people might call it. But however you describe it, the Supreme Court said it is not the role of a state to decide who is going to be on a federal ballot for president. And that ultimately, that comes down to what I think is an appropriate division of powers discussion, is that the whole purpose of a federal system is to have national issues dealt with by a federal authority. And it's hard to imagine what could be a more national issue than the election of a national president, where the votes are cast through a electoral college state by state. So, regardless of what you might think of the result, I think that a reasonable view would be that you can't, there's an old saying that bad cases make bad law. So you can have situations where you hate someone like Donald Trump so much that you are prepared to sacrifice the very fabric of what makes the United States indeed united, in order to keep him out of the White House.
Look, for sure, and look, I think it's even to me, it's more granular than that, or more fundamental. This is an issue of democracy, and democracy is all about the rights of the people to vote in an election, in a fair election, who they want to represent them. And for anybody to remove a candidate from a ballot, or, you and I experienced this at the Supreme Court of Canada, in a case, removing a ballot from the ballot box because of errors that were made. impacts democracy. And no one should be prevented from voting for an individual, one. And once that ballot is placed in the ballot box, unless there is some kind of crime that is actually shown and the process has been followed to show that a crime has been committed, that those ballots should count, that people should be entitled to cast their ballot, in this case with President Trump, for President Trump. I mean, from what I understand from the Colorado decision, it went so far as to prevent people from writing his name on the ballot.
Yeah, it's troubling to a large degree because I often find it quite irksome. People will say it's undemocratic, or what Trump did was undemocratic. What's undemocratic, to my mind, is when you say, I know better than the electorate, and I'm going to decide who you get to vote for and who you don't get to vote for because I'm somehow enlightened by something. I mean, democracy was Winston Churchill said it's a terrible form of government except for all the others, or something to that effect. I've misquoted him, but it's true. I mean, and the thing about democracy is you have to respect the democratic process. You have to respect the outcome of that process. And certainly, I mean, we know of lots of totalitarian states around the world where they purport to have elections, but there's only one name on the ballot.
Well,
that's not much of an election.
They imprison the opposition, and then mysteriously
they take
the
opposition
just happens to not be alive anymore when an election comes up. But
I mean, like the elimination of one's opponent is a pretty undemocratic process. Taking names off the ballot, taking away choice of the electorate is an undemocratic process, because what it does is it takes away the power of the voters to decide by whom they will be governed. And ultimately, and I think what the Supreme Court is talking about is by sending all of that back, all of those issues on insurrection, rebellion, as the 14th Amendment did, to the elected bodies of Congress, rather than, it's not about courts or appointed judges making those decisions. Those decisions about rebellion, insurrection, which would disentitle someone from running for high office, have to be made by people who were duly elected by the electorate. If they're not, then we don't have a democracy at all. And I always come back to it, is that in any democratic society, any institution that does not find its root of power in the vote, one way or the other, by either through appointment by elected representatives or decisions by elected representatives, is inherently undemocratic. Because if you are ruled by an appointed body or an anointed body, I mean, we're going back to kind of pre-Magna Carta-esque view of government, where government is not something that is appointed by the people. And I think that we have to come back again, always to look at the authority for everything in any democratic society must find its way back to the ballot box.
Absolutely. It's, look, democracy is as you say, it may not be the best form of government, but it's probably better than all other forms. It's a precious thing. Everybody wraps themselves in the flag of democracy whenever they make an argument, whether they're upholding democracy or not. So it can be fragile as well, and certainly is subject to different opinions. But when I step back and I look at what is happening in the United States right now, and look, there are a lot of detractors with respect to President Trump. They don't like his ideas. They don't like his policies. They don't like the way that he approaches political subjects, and they don't like the fact that he's an outspoken individual, and he says things that many of us would never dare say. He says them, and so they don't like him. But to basically use the process that has been used against him to remove him from the ballot and to take away the rights of the voter to cast a ballot for him in the states where, and there were 36 states who were filing materials to remove him from the ballot. without looking at the Constitution, without understanding what the 14th Amendment historically was meant to do, and the power with respect to it. I find that shocking. I find that unfair, and I'm not sure that this battle is over because one of the issues that really I don't think gets a lot of airplay is the fact that the majority of the court essentially said that Congress has to enact a statute to deal with insurrection and rebellion. And the minority said, no, that's not what the Reconstruction Amendments do. They are self executing. If somebody commits an insurrection and Congress votes, 67%, I think is what it says in Section 3, that there's an insurrection. Why do you need a statute for that? And, has the majority of the court basically killed Section 3 or, narrowed it to such an extent that you will never be able to find anybody having engaged in insurrection or rebellion. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. And maybe that's a good thing. I mean, I think that as my own view is that the institutions of democracy, and I take a different view. I think the people who prosecuted and the courts who decided these cases were likely fully aware of the history of the 14th Amendment and likely fully aware of their intent and purpose, which was, as you mentioned, the Reconstruction phase of the U.S. after the U.S. Civil War, but proceeded with it anyways to achieve a political outcome. And I think that that's really what I find the most troubling, because I think that the institutions of the courts, institution of the fair application of the law, can't be determined by the outcome you want. I mean, the outcome does not determine, the process. The process has to determine the outcome, not the other way around. I want Donald Trump off the ballot, so I'm going to figure out some way to twist this statute to achieve the outcome I desire. That, in and of itself, to my mind, is a perversion of the court process. And once people lose faith in the institution of the administration of justice in a society, it's one of the greatest strengths, frankly, of the United States. Once people lose faith in that, be it because that your property can be seized because of whatever, or the institution of democracy is not truly democratic. Once they lose faith in the institution of the justice system, the fabric of the U.S. society, which has led to the great success of the United States over the last 300 years, begins to erode because people have lost confidence in that country and its institutions. And I think that's really what I find troubling.
I think for any Western democracy, the courts exist as, in some respects, as a check and balance on government power, where they exceed their powers, particularly under constitutions or in the Canadian context under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as well. So those institutions, the judiciary is an important institution in a Western democracy. But, my view, Gavin, from a political standpoint, not a legal standpoint, being an observer, I'm not an American citizen. I don't vote in their elections. But what I see happening through the various state courts and the constant assault on former President Trump in the courts, what we're seeing, given the polls, is a backlash. And I think people are losing confidence in their court system and their judiciary. Trump is ahead in Georgia. Georgia's trying to prosecute him. In New York, although the Democrats are still ahead, they're not as far ahead as one would expect. And that's where Trump is also being prosecuted and has faced civil trials. So, I think that system is eroding, and I think the U.S. judiciary really needs to take a step back on some of these things, and put things into context, or better context, in my view. That's my opinion.
No, I think that we need to understand that these institutions have made Western democracies great. and that the institutions sometimes are far more important, and the processes are far more important than the outcomes in an individual decision. And that, I think, is something we should all bear in mind. In any event, very interesting discussion. I'm glad that we got this fine sunny day and that you made it here without being assaulted by a pedestrian, which would, of course,
without running anybody over.
Yeah, don't do that. That's not a good thing to do.
No, I wouldn't do that.
I know. Apparently they didn't. So, anyways, everybody, thank you all for listening. Really enjoy any feedback we get. Please rate this podcast in any way you choose. Hopefully 5 stars would be preferential, but certainly not required. And always remember that if no one is above the law, then everyone is beneath it.